This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Mary Frances O'Connor. Today we discuss a somber subject, her new book, The Grieving Brain, the surprising science of how we learn from love and loss. Mary Frances is a grief expert and neuroscientist. She shares today those groundbreaking discoveries about what happens in our brain when we grieve. This is a whole new way to think about and understand love, loss, and learning. We can't avoid loss. It's going to happen to us. Whether it's the loss of a family member, the loss of a friend, the loss of a child, the loss of love. This has been something that humans have dealt with since we've come onto the scene. And it never gets easy. But today, the science is able to see more of what's going on inside of us when these traumatic moments happen. And the hope is we can use this understanding to better deal with these situations. Now, I find all of this fascinating because this is the kind of research, Mary Frances research, her work is the kind of research that will enable us at some point in the future to understand exactly what's going on inside our mind. Now, maybe it won't happen for 1,000,000 years, but I really do think at one point in time in the future, we will figure it out. But even though we're not to that point today, we are really far down the road. And I think you're going to be surprised at some of the insights that Mary Frances brings to this tough topic of grieving. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Mary Frances O'Connor. We've had an interesting 2 years. And I would think for someone in your position, looking at grieving, that this has had to be, for someone who likes to study people and observe people, talk to people, this has had to have been a really interesting time period for someone like yourself.
It really has been very interesting. I mean, beyond devastating, it is also interesting. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that even just in the United States, we've lost around 900,000 people. And so there's quite a lot of people grieving the death of a loved one. But then there's also all sorts of smaller griefs that we're all dealing with. And I think that's been an interesting experience.
Let me throw it out there and be a little controversial right out of the gate. Not only are there people that are grieving from the loss of loved ones, there are people that are grieving from the loss of their livelihood, their business, etc. I mean, I've heard multiple stories secondhand of suicides and whatnot where people just feel like they did not have the direct connection to a COVID death, but they were caught up in the process of trying to fight this.
That's absolutely right. And the overdose rate in the US just went through the roof. Support is so important. And we become accustomed to the way that we do things under a circumstance where suddenly everything is changed. Now, if you don't also have the people surrounding you that you can see every day, that makes every stressor a lot harder.
I'm kind of an odd bird, so to speak, ending up in Asia in my 40s and deciding to stay in a country that most Americans would say, my gosh, this is crazy in of itself. So I like to think, while I did not think this before, I like to think that I've become a little unusually adaptive. But if I look at the last 2 years, wow, this has not been a time period if one was leading a life, and I'm not trying to say necessarily one type of life is better than the other, but if one was living a life of routine prior to the last 2 years, a life of routine was not prepared for what happened.
That's absolutely right. Flexibility is related to resilience. And boy, we have had to be flexible on so many different levels. The thing is, that's hard for the brain to do. As we are figuring out if we're wearing a mask to this meeting, or even if the meeting is online or in person, all of that processing is going on in the background where usually it wouldn't be happening at all. And so the idea that we all might be a little more on edge than usual, that we might be a little more reactive than usual, is probably in part because our brain is doing so much in the background, trying to just cope with the amount of change that's happening.
And there's only so much that the brain can do. So if we have this normal life, the routine is smashed, and then you have to do all these new things. The brain has to occupy its time on all these new things while continuing to do the so-called old things. That in of itself, the reduced bandwidth, that causes big problems.
It does. And it's so funny. I think people who have grieved the death of a spouse or the death of a child will recognize this is what grief feels like, where your whole life gets ripped apart. There's nothing that you can do that feels like habit anymore because everything you did involved this other person at some level. That not being able to concentrate, feeling the emotion dial volumed up, all of that, I think, is something that people deal with when they lose a loved one. But right now, we're all dealing with it at the same time, which is just a whole other level.
Now, your work is not necessarily specific to the loss of a loved one. As I mentioned earlier, I said something about perhaps someone that lost their business in this process. This is the idea of grieving that can come from any type of loss. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's right. I believe that probably originally the biggest problem social mammals had to deal with was, in fact, the loss of each other. We're social mammals. We rely on each other. We are born helpless. The fact that we need our loved ones can't be overstated. And I think then it's possible that as life got more complex, other types of losses kind of piggybacked on what the brain was already doing to understand the loss of a loved one. And I think that might be part of why it feels a little bit similar. But often it is specifically the response to the loss of something that is a part of you. If we use the word parent, that implies two people. Even though it may be that you've lost a child, it's really changed your identity as well. Well, losing a business is the same thing. Your identity is business owner. And now, if you don't have that, you've really lost a piece of yourself. I think that might be why the feeling is a little bit similar.
In preparing to speak with you today, I was thinking about some examples that I've seen. One in person when I was back in the States over the holidays, a younger family member who lost a spouse over a decade ago, still struggling with the issue. But I've also noticed online two friends who lost their father, one maybe several months ago, one several years ago. And interesting for me to observe their public reactions, ongoing public reactions. So in preparing to speak with you, I was thinking about all these different ways that I observe people with grief or grieving. And some people really seem, and look, perhaps I'm very fortunate at the moment. I'm not grieving, or do I have any great grief about any particular issue? You and I know that could change on a moment. But in observing these other people, I feel sad in the sense that my first feeling is they seem stuck. And they're telling the world they're stuck. But as an outsider, what can you do? Everyone's going through, for whatever their grieving or grief might be at the moment, they're going through it. But it's interesting to observe when you see people that look like they're stuck.
Yeah. To see the range of grief that we see, I think it kind of helps to explain that when you think about the love that you feel for people is each very different, isn't it? I think of each grief being as different as the relationship that you had with that person. While we see patterns when we do empirical research, it is also the case that grief is very individual to the love of that relationship. So I think the variation is there. It is difficult sometimes to be with people who are grieving. It touches our own vulnerability. It touches our own feeling of helplessness. I don't know what to do. How can I help? And I think it can be helpful to remember that they are figuring out what to do next, and we don't need to be there to cheer them up. That often actually backfires and kind of makes them feel worse because they don't feel cheered up, but rather to really let them tell us what their experience is like. Sometimes that opportunity to really even talk about the experiences they're having helps them to figure out what is going on, what might be stuck, and what might be moving.
Let me offer a thought to what you said that sometimes maybe I'm paraphrasing a little how you said it, but it could be difficult to be around people that could be grieving. I find that true. However, there's also, and maybe this will sound a touch controversial to some, but I think also for me, if the grieving, the public way that it's happening, if it goes on for some extended period of time, I don't know how to define time here. It's kind of like you know it when you see it. Then I find it very not hard to be around. And again, then you start to worry about that individual's own mental health, that if they've not gotten past it, not that I can define what their grieving period should be. Maybe if you see a situation where there's grieving going on a decade later, then that starts to, I don't feel uncomfortable. I feel more like, wow, I wish that person could speak with someone. I wish that person could get some assistance.
I think it can be helpful to sort of distinguish between the words grief and grieving, which of course in normal conversation we use kind of interchangeably. But the reason I like to differentiate is when you think about grief, that sort of knock you off your feet ferocity of deep wanting this person back, that actually can happen at any time. That can happen 40 years later, where you just get knocked off your feet when you, I don't know, open the drawer and you see your husband's wallet and suddenly you're back like it happened yesterday. And the reason I think that's so interesting is holidays are often times when grief overwhelms us. And you had mentioned being home at a holiday. So I think if you, for example, only see people at the holidays, there's sort of a chance that this person is experiencing grief in the moment. The distinction I make then is with grieving, which is how things change over time. I think that's what you're getting at, that for most people, even if they continue to have these moments where they're knocked off their feet, their way of relating to that changes. The 101st time that you get knocked off your feet and you think, I just can't bear this, you may also say, although it is familiar, I do know what this is like. And even that is sort of a change. So that change is often what we're looking for. Not that they will feel better, not that grief will be over, but they will figure out how to bring it with them and still pursue a meaningful life.
Let's jump into, for the audience out there that might already be thinking, give me something that is not arguably opinion. Now, you have gone into the neuroimaging of this. You have gone into the deep physiological aspects of this. When you are analyzing a person, a patient, and you are allowed to analyze their brain, what can you tell us lay people about what's going on that you can see physically?
Yeah.
And I hold on. In your answer, let's face it, my question is this broad softball question. Your answer, you're already thinking, Mike, this might take a couple weeks.
No, I'm not really thinking that. But probably because I have thought about how to interpret these studies for a long time, maybe. When we look in the brain, we see that lots of brain regions, of course, are activated when we have grief. Even that moment of being knocked off your feet, it still encompasses a lot of different brain regions. So we don't look so much just for the one region anymore. What we do know is that what we call the reward network in the brain, so this is several different regions of the brain that are connected, because they are so important for forming a bond. If you have a father looking at a picture as kindergartner, or you have a spouse looking at their partner, you see areas of this reward network being activated because the brain is really trying to motivate us. It's using anything in its arsenal, dopamine, oxytocin, anything it can get to sort of reward and encourage you to spend time with this person, to seek them out if they're missing, And that bond then, that way of responding to this person must change if you're not going to see that person on this earthly plane again. What we think is partly happening is that the way that the reward system is interacting with what it's expecting to see again, how it understands the permanence or the acceptance of this loss, that is different in different people or in different points in grieving.
But the similarities, the patterns, do they exist? So if we're analyzing, let's say, 100 individuals, we know they're in a period of either grief or grieving, and we're doing the neuroimaging. Is there something that we can see that allows us to go, okay, now we almost can tell what that person, we don't know the exact details, but we know what kind of state they're in? Are we at that point?
We do have studies, these are done by Noam Schneck out of Columbia, where people were in the neuroimaging scanner and he asked them to think about their loved one, whether that's stories about them or pictures of them. He used a method called machine learning, where they told him when they were thinking about their loved one and when they weren't. And then he looked at the patterns in the brain to see if he could find sort of a fingerprint. What was the pattern of activation when they were thinking about their loved one? Surprisingly, perhaps, not 100% accurate, but it was possible for him to tell then in later scans if that fingerprint was activated in this individual. So it doesn't mean that the fingerprint looks the same across everyone, but that he was able to detect it within a person across several scans. That, I think, is just a fascinating research experience.
It really is, because we like to think that we're human. We can keep our thoughts in our mind and no one can see what's going on and we're secretive and we're special and all this. But then you start to take it apart and we have some commonalities.
Well, I should say it's not that it's mind reading. So, for example, if the participant had not told him, okay, this is when I was thinking about them and this is when I wasn't, he wouldn't have been able to figure it out. So the person had to reveal that in order to have the machine learning work.
Let's talk about time. I can think about situations in my life, I think, where I've dealt with either grief or grieving. It's been primarily on relationships ending. And when those relationships end or in the process of ending or after they've ended, the grief or the grieving can come into play. I have found, and I want you to explain it more in an academic sense or perhaps your experience, but I have found the two hacks, so to speak. The one hack that I don't really like, which is time. You just need time. Time will help. But I think even more than time, for me, it's replacement, meaning it's a big world. There's lots of people. And I'm not trying to sound cavalier or anything, but it's amazing that if someone goes away in your life, if you have the ability to open your eyes and start to poke around, it's amazing how many interesting, great people there are out there beyond the ones that you had before.
I do think that the brain is set up for this in a way. It can enable us to do that. And here's the big example that we can all relate to. There was a time in your life when your parents were the most important attachment you had. They were the ones you turned to when you felt good, when you felt bad, when you had a question. And all of us at some point leave home and they are no longer the most important person. There is a best friend, or there is a boyfriend or girlfriend, or eventually a spouse. They are now the person that you would turn to if you feel good or bad or need advice. And so I think the brain is set up to enable us to form attachments, form bonds, and after a period, to form new bonds again, because it is important to our survival that we have attachments, that we have these loving relationships. So there has to be a way to try and find that again, even though it won't be the same, I would say, as the relationship that you had. And although you may still, oddly, even ask the person advice in your mind, say, for example, there is clearly a way that somehow the brain is able to form new bonds, just like you say.
And it's tricky in the sense that I have found, depending on where one is located, the ability to find new bonds can vary dramatically. So if one is in a community that is not highly populated, where everyone knows everyone, that could be difficult. Whereas if one is in an environment, perhaps a larger city, there's a lot more people. It sounds so basic, but there's a lot of truth to this in my mind, at least, that if there's more opportunity to replace, then your chances and your odds, speaking like a math guy, your chances and your odds go up. If the opportunity is down and then you're kind of trying to get back to routine and you've already kind of scanned the horizon and your replacements don't exist, or you can't imagine any of the current replacements making up for the person that's gone, I don't know if enough people get that advice or understand that unless they have the chance to move around, so to speak.
It's interesting. What it reminds me of is women, of course, we know live longer than men, and older women who become widowed talk about wanting to create new relationships, and that literally there aren't, for those who are seeking a man, that there just aren't as many peers out there now. It's a different version than what you're talking about, but it can feel very lonely to know that it's not going to work the way it did before.
Well, it gets back to the geography aspect too, is that, and I can think of an example, and I won't give particulars, but I can think of an example right now of an older woman over 80. I've had conversations with her about this very issue. And I think it becomes, okay, you're right, macro, but from a micro perspective, where can she go if her current situation is not great for the odds replacement? Where could she go that potentially the odds might be a lot better to find maybe a guy over the age of 80 who'd be more of her peer? That's tricky too.
It is. And I also can think of a client who really struggled with this. It is interesting, though, just to be fair to maybe the wider set of listeners, not everyone wants to replace. And I'm not sure anyone wants to replace per se, rather to reattach or bond with someone new. It is also the case that attachment needs aren't necessarily the same as dating or getting married. There are a lot of older adults that find that companionship becomes vitally important to them. My own father always had very close friends that he would travel with. And after my mom died, he would have dinner with 3 or 4 nights a week. And he derived so much joy from those relationships. They weren't romantic relationships. I think it's also interesting to consider the range of human relationships that are possible.
Just to add to that too, here I am in Asia. It's also interesting to observe men and women across different cultures, where you might find also, as an American growing up, okay, America does seem to be a little bit more where men and women are generally in relationships of a similar age. That seems to be more of an American thing. It might be very different in a place like Asia. The man might end up being much older.
Yeah, there is such a range of cultural expressions of relationships. It's really kind of remarkable.
Let me take it to kind of a big picture issue. We've kind of danced around it a little bit, but why does grieving take so long? Just as a big picture question, why does it take so long? Like, what are all of the aspects that are forcing this to be such a long process? I can look back in time and I can think of certain relationships. In hindsight, I'm like, why did I give the ending of that so much time? It was going to get to the same place anyways. It was over. But why did I think about it so much? And then I look back years later and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to say it was not the relationship was a waste of time, but I find looking back sometimes in hindsight, the grieving period was like, in my mind, being a rationalist, I'm like, God, that seems like such a waste of time. Mike, why did you do that grieving for so long when it was not going to help you in any way? I mean, maybe it did. Hold on, maybe you're going to argue it did help me.
Well, I don't know. I think we are not so clear that when you form a bond with someone, it really is the case that your brain is using, as I said earlier, every chemical at its disposal to try and motivate you to stay with that person. I mean, those are powerful drugs going on naturally in your brain. I think the other thing that happens, because you can think about it this way, when we bond with someone, there is inherent in that neural encoding that this person will persist, that this person is our one and only. Although, even on a rational level, we may say, well, that's not true. There's a lot of neural machinery that is encouraging us to believe that. And here's the example, when you kiss your spouse goodbye, when they go off to work in the morning, you expect that they're coming back. And if they didn't, it would be very upsetting to you. This is the prediction that your brain has set up. This person, I can let them be out of my sight because I know they're coming back, or I will go and find them. That intensity of that bond and the really, I think, even physiological aspect to that bond, then when the person is gone, think of it this way. Your brain is a prediction machine. It's partly there to help us explain what's going to happen next and help us prepare for it. Well, if you think of the case of a man who wakes up and his wife isn't next to him there in bed, the most logical prediction is not that she's died. And so it takes the brain a long time. It's almost that she hasn't, in the sense that the brain has to come to a point where it can make the prediction, you know what, she's not going to be here again. And I think we forget how much that physiology matters, that when we bond with, if you look at pair bonded mate for life kind of voles, a kind of rodent, you actually can see that once that bond is created, it's like a gun has been cocked. And as soon as there is separation, cortisol, or the rodent equivalent of cortisol, that stress hormone goes up upon separation, only because that bond has been formed. And so it isn't the same as just not seeing a colleague for a while, or my class changes over. I never expect to see the same students in those seats again. But the physiology is really about persisting in belief that this is your one and only.
Why do you think some people choose at that moment you just described? Why do some people choose to go with the substances to overcome versus some people don't? What do you think is going on there where the choices are made, where some people just, maybe they say to themselves, I can't take it, I need to drink, or I need to take this drug or whatever. And then other people might just wallow in it or exercise more or something. I'm not saying the people that don't take the substances are overcoming faster. I'm just saying it's interesting, that pivot that some make.
We definitely know that substance use goes up often in general. You're right, there are individual differences, but it is certainly common in a lot of people, and even in cultural responses. So I grew up Irish Catholic, and a wake definitely has alcohol at it. So the question, though, is why then? Why, with this waves of grief, why is that the moment? And I think for many people, it is genuinely the worst they have ever felt. It kind of resets the range of what feeling bad can look like. And many of them want and maybe even need to escape that in some way or another. And there's a lot of individual differences. Some of us do get to feeling better after we've gone for a run or something, but a lot of people just really want that pain to be over for a minute. I think while we know it's not healthy for them and it doesn't necessarily help them with the grieving, with the learning process, I think that just level of emotional pain is really what leads to that.
If I look at America in the abstract right now, America has some alcohol problems. It has some fentanyl problems. I don't know, big picture, what is driving these. I'm sure many of these people are in a grief or a grieving moment. Some of them perhaps just wanted to have fun in the moment and it got addicted. I don't know the range necessarily, but it sure seems like that if a society is going down the substance side heavily, and look, I know something like fentanyl, I mean, it's basically heroin. You get on that, these people can't rationally get off it. Do you think if we were to look at the substance abuse, this is a big, wide question, but do you think if we were to look at the substance abuse in America, is it coming back to something like the subject of your work? Is that where it's starting from?
I think that's an interesting question. I think First, I will say this is a little outside my usual stomping ground of psychology. I will say substance use is very multi determined. I think when people feel that they are hopeless, that they don't see any economic opportunities for themselves, or they don't see any relationship opportunities for themselves, certainly that increases the, well, this is something I can do to feel better in the moment. It is very multiply determined. I do think grief can be a contributing factor. In fact, a person I know here in Tucson, Arizona, works with what we call opportunity youth. So these are young people between, say, 16 and 24 who are not connected to work or school. So maybe they've been in the juvenile justice system, maybe they've been in the foster care system. In whatever way, he is helping to provide some structure and a place for them to go. What he discovered, and many of them get in trouble with drugs, many of them get in trouble with the police. One thing he discovered that I think was very insightful was when he talked one-on-one with these individual youth, he discovered there was often a story of a grief that they experienced, the death of an important person in their life, that they never had any way of understanding what was happening. And the level of emotion that got turned up in them was not something they knew how to do anything with. And it led them to do things that didn't feel like they were even of their own volition. And so they're actually creating a system of bereavement support so that these young people have a way to talk to each other, to talk to bereavement counselors, to see if that actually can change the trajectory of what these young people are experiencing.
That's a really interesting thought. My first thinking when you say that is it kind of sounds like, okay, people lacking a mentor on specifically this issue of grief or grieving. Now, you brought up the disadvantaged youth example. I'm going to throw it out another way. I think I've observed people that have plenty of money, plenty of societal protection, but then they use that to create isolation. The money actually doesn't help them because, okay, they can do anything they want. Then they just fall into the abyss and they don't allow the mentor, they don't allow the other thoughts from other learned people to come into the conversation to potentially help them because they think, well, I don't need help from anybody. This is my situation. And they've got enough money to do whatever they want. So it's on the range of spectrums of people in terms of disadvantaged or advantaged. It seems like there can be a common result of not knowing what to do and not having a mentor.
Yeah. How to go about creating a meaningful life. Boy, that is the question in a way, isn't it? I think it is often the case that the most meaningful things come from connecting between two people. And often that means having compassion or wanting to be of service to another person or being willing to share your own vulnerability. And that's not something that's easy for humans to do. If there are ways we can buffer ourselves from feeling those things and sharing those feelings, I think it's understandable that people do that, not understanding necessarily that that can be what creates those bonds. And in the long run, those bonds are what's going to make them feel better, not the new flashy thing they can buy.
Yeah, isolation is not the solution.
Yeah. And it can be really hard because you get into a delusion that we are separate from each other. And it's just simply not true. I mean, if there's one thing that coronavirus has showed us, it is how interconnected we all are, from literally the air you breathe in a room to the interactions you have on the street. We are, as human beings, we are an organism all together. And so I think when we forget and we think that our self ends at the ends of our fingertips, it doesn't actually work that way. It really is that a bonded couple, for example, is a unit, or a nuclear family is a unit, and they operate as a system. And so I think if we forget and we pretend that we're separate from each other, then you don't get to enjoy the transcendence, the sort of love and compassion that you have when you are more vulnerable and also provide care for another person.
What started you down this path? Why are you like you are today? What age were you when you knew you were going down this path? First of obviously psychology, you're going down this path. Tell me that first moment when you knew you were going there, and then pivot it to where this particular topic of grieving, grief became really important to you.
This will not surprise you. I've always been sort of a nerdy kid. And I went off to college thinking I was going to be a music major. In my first year of college, I had to take a breadth course. So I took Intro to Neuroscience because someone in my dorm was taking it. And boy, I was just hooked. I just thought that was fascinating to be able to look into the black box of the brain. In my Intro to Neuroscience textbook, there was just 2 sentences about functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRIs, which were brand new technology. I never thought I was actually going to get to use one, but I just thought that's fascinating. And eventually my music teacher said to me, we spend more time talking about how the brain learns music than we spend playing. And he said, I think maybe your heart is somewhere else. So that part has been true for quite a long time. On the more personal side, my mother developed breast cancer when I was 13, lived with it for another 13 years, which her oncologist described her as his first miracle. She wasn't supposed to live through the year. And so watching my mother confront her own sort of mortality and how that impacted our family, I think it made it possible for me to have these conversations, to feel comfortable talking with people about their experience of grief. And that somehow enabled me then to stay in the conversation. And that allowed me to gather data and find patterns in that data. There is a way in which my desire to help my mom has sort of been transmuted into wanting to help other people who are experiencing grief and difficult emotions.
So you mentioned being Irish Catholic. I went to a grade 1 through 12 Catholic school. My high school was named O'Connell. What's really interesting, though, for me is the comparison to think about that upbringing. And then I've spent the last 8 years in a Buddhist country, the moment of right now, the present moment. And now I've seen plenty of Asian folks who, even though they say, okay, I'm Buddhist and whatnot, but then their actions to me seem very Christian, so to speak. They seem stuck in the past sometimes. But for me, I find this comparison between the different cultures and being in a culture that is a little more thinking about the present moment, whereas I think my upbringing, it was more about thinking about the past. And I think if one can find their way, especially if they're dealing with grief or grieving, if they can find their way, and I'm not just trying to sound Alan Watts-esque here, but if they can find their way to the moment, to the right now, and then open their eyes and see who's walking around them and see who's in their field of vision, it's amazing what can happen when one just lets go.
Yeah. It's this interesting phenomena, I think, where people who are grieving sort of feel like, why would I spend time in the present moment? It's really painful. In reality, human beings aren't able to only shut off the negative emotions. So they can either shut off emotion or not. And what that means is you're shutting off all the positive emotions at the same time. Spending time in the present moment can mean experiencing the deep pain and suffering of losing a loved one, but it also allows for anything that is joyful that's happening in the moment as well. Just as you say, if you look around, you can suddenly see, wow, it's amazing. This furniture was built by someone and is so beautiful. Just so many things that happen in the moment if you are able to spend time in the moment. But it's pretty hard as human beings for us to do it.
It is, especially, I think, and again, I make the distinction between cultures. I'm not saying, I think on many aspects of where you go, cultural differences are irrelevant, but I do think you can see cultural differences. And I guess get back to my big picture thought when I'm thinking about our conversation, which is, how does one move on? And if one is isolated, it can be harder to move on. If one has the opportunity, look, let's just make an example. Somebody is a young widower. She's in her 30s. She lost her husband to, let's say, suicide. she has to move on. And she's got, there could be young children in these situations. Years go by and maybe a person's a little bit kind of stuck. But then if they can't get out of that stuck, it's been my observation that if more people come into their purview, for example, it won't be someone to replace her husband, but if it's more men that she could talk to, maybe it's just platonic, who knows, whatever. But just the chance to talk with people. When you start talking to another person and you're listening to them and I'm listening to you, I can't be thinking about the other person that's no longer here the way the brain works. You end up focusing on that person right now. And it seems like when that can happen, it just seems like that's the road to recovery.
I think it is one road for sure. When psychotherapy is happening with people who are stuck, as you would describe it, we do work with them to think about who is in your current environment that you could strengthen your relationship with. Who is it that might understand you if you were to open up to them? Who is it in your environment that needs you? And could you strengthen your relationship with them? Even if it's not the person you're sort of had imagined that you would grow closer to. I think we need each other. We need that connection. And so whether that is her meeting another widow who understands where she's coming from and them being able to have a strong relationship because of that, or whether that means meeting another man if she's straight and deciding that this is something she wants to pursue. I would definitely not say that they replace, but we have attachment needs and they can fulfill those needs in a way that a deceased person just can't.
Let me push on you a little bit. Why do you not like replace? Why does that cause you some discomfort when that comes out of my mouth? Why do you not like that?
It doesn't feel like the right word. And that's for a few different reasons, I think. One is that the relationship with your first husband and your second husband is just not the same. Here's a story that might help. In one of the research interviews I was doing with an older man, he was telling me a story about having married his high school sweetheart, and they had 2.5 kids and the white picket fence. And he was just so happy, just loved her so much. And she got breast cancer, and he talked about caregiving for her when she was terminally ill, and he got upset. And we went on and talked a little more. And then he told me that had happened maybe 3 years ago. And he told me that recently he had met a woman who he was spending some time with, and she was nothing like his deceased wife, that she made him feel different, but they were doing a lot of things together and that felt good. He said to me at one point, he looked at me and he said, the thing is, it was good then and it's good now. And so to me, it's more that you've added to the relationship experiences that you've had and you're getting your attachment needs met. But the idea of replacing them as though you would think about them less or you wouldn't have their memory salient to you, that just doesn't sort of fit with my experience of people who are widowed and remarried, say, for example.
Fair enough. I guess when I was thinking of the word replace, I was thinking more in a real kind of macro level of like, okay, I'm with this person is gone, there's a void here. How do I replace the void? Not that I'm replacing exactly the other person, but just the void. How do I maybe fill the void is the better way to say it.
I certainly recognize that I have this need to love and be loved, and I'm not getting to express that. Who can I express that with? That I definitely understand.
Since you're a keen observer of people, and I know you just, whether it's in the university or in the society or traveling or whatnot, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, and this is a little bit off subject, but I'm curious your perspective of observing. I've observed during the pandemic, I've had a chance to be in America, in Dubai, and Vietnam, so a chance to observe people in 3 different places, which is probably more than most people because a lot of people have not traveled. But what is your observation from a psychological standpoint? What's your observation? And I'm not looking for you to make a diagnosis or anything like that, but just an observation of people. How do you feel when you observe people right now in the middle of this unique situation? In your case, observing Americans in this unique situation where people have had changes thrown at their routine. They've had new things they've had to do Specifically, that could be vaccines, it could be masks, it could be social distancing. What is this doing to us at a root level? And then the follow-up to this would be, how long is it going to take for us to get back to normal, or will we ever?
Yeah, the first part of that, the what is happening, I think that all of our basic assumptions have been a little bit shattered. Whether you go to school or whether you go to the office, that's never been a discussion before, and certainly not on a week by week basis. And so I think once you sort of shuffle all of the possible habits and interactions that we would have, and then you add the threat of a life ending or certainly terrible illness to that, I think it means that often human beings go back to, okay, so what is fundamentally important here? And it takes a while for each individual to figure that out. I think that's a little bit why we're seeing the great resignation. We're suddenly like, what is important to me? Is it this job? Do I want to make a change? So while I'm not sure that we've all gotten to the what is fundamentally important to us yet, just that flux of even considering things differently puts a lot of stress and strain on relationships, on organizations, on governments, on neighborly interactions. There's no habit to just rely on. Do I walk down the street? Do I step out into the street as someone comes toward me? Do I do an elbow bump? Even at that level, there's no habit to just rely on. You're now thinking about it instead of thinking about something else that's more maybe productive. I think this is part of why, with the back burner of our mind going constantly, I think this is part of why we're more short-tempered. This is certainly what we're seeing on airplanes, that people just don't have the resilience, the elasticity to just cope with what is happening. There is just so much short-temperedness going on, because when you have a hammer, the world all looks like a nail. I think that we can actually learn a lot from people who have grieved and have grown because of that. You asked, when will we go back to normal? And I think that's a little bit like saying, when is grief going to be over? I think this becomes a part of who we are, of how we interact. I think we will develop new habits. In fact, one of the reasons I think Omicron was so devastating as a new variant was that we had finally maybe gotten into some new habits. We kind of knew how to operate in the new world. Then Omicron threw all those habits out the window. I think we will develop new norms and new habits, but I think that's still quite a ways off. Hopefully for many people, this is the silver lining talking, but hopefully for many people, it will be a more intentional life that they're choosing.
I don't disagree with anything that you just said. My observation, which 2 years into this, the observation that is causing me some discomfort because I think it potentially leads to conflict, maybe it's micro or macro conflict, which is right now I observe a significant portion of the population globally is afraid, and a significant portion of the population globally is not afraid. This is a really interesting observation for me. And where does that lead? Because it's two very different stances, and both stances have their territory marked out as to why they are right. And it's psychological time bomb there.
Yeah. I think that when we are anxious and afraid, one of the things human beings do is go into us-them mode. That's how I feel safe. I know who us is, and I know who us is because we're not them. I think when you think back to this idea that the human population is sort of a system unto itself, I think the fact that many of us are having different reactions to how we're coping, how afraid we feel, what mitigation strategies we want to take, again, from a long-term perspective, a society, I think, does well when it can incorporate a bunch of different views. Perhaps it makes everyone do a little bit more or less than they would have otherwise because of what their neighbor is doing. And hopefully that actually, as a group, makes us safer because the extremes kind of get reeled in, as it were, extremely afraid or extremely not afraid. So that's my hope.
I'll leave it on your optimistic perspective. We don't want to let me open the can opener too much here. The book, The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss. Mary Frances, we have just scratched the surface today. You dive in deep into your work. I recommend people checking out your book, The Grieving Brain. Where can we send people? Where would you like to direct them to find you, to, I don't know, come show up at your office? And I don't want them to show up at your office. Maybe it's useful. I don't know. But where can we send people?
If they go to thegrievingbrain.com, it will direct them to my website that they can connect with the book there.
Cool. Hey, thank you for coming on. This is one of these topics where I think you and I know we could probably just sit down like in a pub or something, or a restaurant, and probably turn on the microphone and talk for 10 hours and try to pick things apart. What's really interesting too is that even though there's a lot of just wisdom in your words, it's a topic that there's a lot of points of view. There's a lot of perspectives. It's not an easy area to throw yourself into the middle of.
Yeah, it's true.
Listen, again, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
I've really enjoyed it, Michael. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.